I mean, lots of interesting stuff. They had Amy Jill Levine speaking.
She's wonderful.
She is excellent, and just reminding us how easy it is to get things wrong about Judaism, even without intending it. I mean, there are some Christians who are very keen to diss Judaism, but even if when you're not trying to do that, it's very easy to make assumptions or to say things that actually aren't true about it. So that was incredibly interesting. And then they had somebody talking, had a session on the right to protest, and whether that's, I mean, obviously in the German context, but very much in this context too, whether the right to protest is shrinking.
Interesting.
And they had Carla Hinrich, who was one of the member of Last Generation, which is like, what's it called? Extinction Rebellion in this country. But saying what disturbs her most is the anger that their protests evoke and how much anger there is in society. And I think, yeah, that's true, really. And then there's the thing about the Civicus rating, where the UK is a country of concern in terms of civil society, which that wasn't directly said at the session, but they were talking about the register, and it gave me a chance to look it up and to discover that.
Wow.
So, and there's another session where we had to role play as members of the European Council about what to do with immigration, and it was just really interesting. And one of the part of the discussion afterwards was whether Jesus was killed by populism. Was it populists who?
Wow.
Which is one legitimate reading, I think, and maybe because he was too woke, makes these undesirable people, which clearly you're not supposed to do.
Yeah,
you're respectable. So they seem to fit very well, really. So
right, let's kick off. Yep. Can you see that? Slideshow from the beginning. So, welcome. This is the second of four studies before we break up for summer. I think next Tuesday rather is the next Augustine session, and after that we'll have a couple more, and then we'll have a summer break. But just having a sort of introduction really to the 8th century prophets. And last time we looked at Amos, and just do a quick reminder, and then I'll do a little introduction to Amos, and then we'll read a little bit from him and discuss that. Just why are they important? Why are the 8th century prophets important? I think most important is their contemporary relevance. I mean, they were writing within very specific historic circumstances, but circumstances which are not at all alien to us, particularly if you look at events taking place in the so-called Middle East, but also situations of conflict, situations of corruption, situations of great big imbalances of wealth.
Let's mention that Esther's coming. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay. So yeah, and they were taking part in, hi Esther. Nice to see you. In sort of what you might call epoch-shaping events. I mean, the things that were taking place around them were shifting the geopolitical dynamics. We're just talking about the 8th century prophets, Esther. They were the first prophets who actually wrote their stuff down. Previously, Elisha, Elijah, and all of those had said their stuff, but their stuff is recorded in Kings and Chronicles rather than actually in their own writings. And they weren't just court prophets. They weren't people who just spoke to the kings. They were the first prophets, again, who spoke to the whole country. And this is who they are: Amos, Hosea, Micah, and first Isaiah, and also Jonah. But we're not going to look at Jonah because Jonah is a bit different. Jonah was writing in the 8th century too, or the book of Jonah is about the 8th century. And just a bit, again, I said this last time, but just get the overall picture. So we're after the death of Solomon, you will know this, but the kingdom's divided, and the 10 tribes of Israel were in what we call the northern kingdom of Israel, whose capital was Samaria, and whose main shrine was Shechem. And the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained in the south, with Jerusalem there as both the religious and the political capital. And you can read the story in both 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. There's chapters which tell the story of this period that we're covering in the prophets. And as I said last time, it was a century of 2 halves. In the first half of the century, Assyria, the big power in the north, was very weak. And so that allowed the vassal states, the smaller states, to flex their muscles, to trade, to have military activities against each other, to test each other out in terms of expansion of land and territory. And so it was a time of prosperity for both the north and the south, for Israel and for Judah. But in the second half, Assyria reasserted itself, and we'll see this begin to impact. Assyria reasserts itself in the second half of the century, and in 745, 727, this great Assyrian, very Putin-like ruler, Tiglath-Pileser III, Paul, this was his name, he seizes the throne in Assyria and he expands with military force. And you can see, I think I showed this map this last time as well, that in the first half of the century, this kingdom of Urartu, that's Armenia now, was very strong, and that kept Assyria weak. But in the second half, Assyria, as you can see from this dark green, as it was at the start of the 8th century, by the end of the early part of the 7th century, you can see that Assyria stretched out all the way through to Egypt in this yellow part. So it's a massive, massive imperial expansion taking place at the time. So today we'll look at Hosea. There he is, cuddling his wife. Let's talk about Hosea. These are the kings, forget that. We'll go back to whatever we need to. It's a difficult book, and if you read through it and pick it up and just read through it, I mean, you shouldn't be surprised if you don't quite get what it's on about. If the Saint Jerome, a long time ago, said this: if in the interpretation of all the prophets we stand in need of the intervention of the Holy Spirit, how much more should the Lord be invoked in interpreting Hosea? And in St. Peter's words, should it be said, expound for us this parable. So St. Jerome, who translated the Bible, he couldn't understand it. So what chance do we stand? Put it that way. It's disjointed, it's problematic, and obscure rather, and its reception over the years by people has been difficult as well. People just can't make head or tail of what's going on. Calvin was quite disgusted by it. He couldn't possibly believe that God would want Hosea to do what Hosea apparently had done. But we'll come to that in a minute. I think, who was he, first of all? I mean, he was a prophet of the Northern Kingdom. Probably was a prophet around the time of 750 to 725. That seems to be pretty well consensus about that. In the reign of Jeroboam II, and this period of prosperity and expansion. And remember last time we looked at Amos, and we saw that whilst 2 Kings talks about Jeroboam in very positive light, Amos actually was giving a counter view and was quite critical, was very critical of the era of Jeroboam II. And, you know, was he a prophet? This kind of question, was Hosea actually a real person, a prophet? Or is Hosea actually a character in a book? So is he fictional? And is it possibly a reading back from the time after the exile, when the people come back? Is it reading back and explaining to people why they had such a bad time and why they were had been, you know, punished in the way they were for what they were doing? Or is it a contemporary document? And so all of these questions are around, and we don't have to worry about them tonight. But I think just throw them out there so that we understand that it's all right to ask lots of questions about this book, because nobody really knows. And so there is no definitive answer, but these are possibilities. And there are some similarities with Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Deuteronomy, and you know, this particularly around the covenant. My brain's gone a bit blank, but I'll come back to that point when I remember what it really is. And then he had a wife. We're going to read about his wife, Gomer. And he had this difficult marriage, and the language in Hosea is quite violent. It's about sexual violence. It's quite disturbing imagery that we would feel really uncomfortable with, quite rightly feel uncomfortable with. As I said, Calvin felt uncomfortable with it, so if he did, so would he. And so what we don't know is whether this is historical. When we read it, we'll read it in a few minutes. Is this historical? Was Hosea in a relationship with a prostitute, which is what Zoe says? Or is this was this an actual marriage with a wife who was not faithful to him? Or is this an allegory? Is this something, is this a fictitious thing which is trying to make a point? And you might want to come to some conclusions about that as we move on. But what we'll see as we read the first 3 chapters is that this is quite disturbing story of a marriage that didn't work. And he has 3 children, and we'll see this as well. The first, and then the names are really, really important. And the 3 names of his children, which we'll come across in a minute when we read the chapters, are really quite significant. The eldest child was called Jezreel, which means God sows. In Jezreel, the place, was where the house of Jehu, the king, was. That's where the seat of the dynasty of the house of Jehu, which was ruled and established by bloodshed. So God sows implies that there's going to be a punishment because of the bad behavior of the house of Jehu. Then the second child, Lo Ruhamah, not pitied, suggests that there's going to be a coming judgment in which there will be no pity. And the last child, Lo Amni, not means not my people, suggests a kind of disruption in the covenant. And just some religious background as well, because this is really important, because again, you might see that this is really quite an important part of Hosea. Hosea seems to be more interested in the cult, in the religious malpractice of Israel. Amos seems to be more interested in the social, cultural, the economic injustices. But he talks about the Canaanite cults, Baal or Baalim, possibly more than one god. And these were their sort of fertility cults. And Baal, who we read about in there, is the sort of main offspring of the supreme god El and his wife Anna. And Baal is the god of winter, rain, and storms, so influences the welfare of the land. And also, when you read Hosea, you get a lot of, you can see that there's a real interest in ecology, in the fertility of the land, and that Baal was a dying and rising god who in the summer was slain by Mot, the god of drought, but rises again in the winter when the rains come. So that was there. And in the fertility cults, this cosmic union of gods and goddesses affects the same power in nature. So when the gods and the goddesses come together, then there's some sort of sympathetic magic. So in the cults, there would be cultic prostitution, to experience sexual union with a male and female as an effort to induce fertility between the god and the goddesses, and therefore in the land. So the rituals would have some sort of sexual behavior within them. And there would be sexual promiscuity at worship festivals, the new moon festivals, and so on. So a good time was had by all. Sorry, Harley. But that sort of very sexualized kind of cultic fertility cults were taking place at the time, and so there's a critique of that in there which you need to bear in mind. And there's a statue of the Baal, god of fertility and storms. Okay, now then let's read. So that's a long introduction, but it's just background stuff. So when we come to reading it, we might get some. Not do so with. No, it's not this one. No, that's not it. I'm sorry. Hi, Neil. Yeah, that's the one, is it not? So there's 3 chapters here, but they're not long chapters. Well, they are quite long. But I think it's quite good. And if we focus on these, but what we try and see is whether or not from these chapters we can get a sense of what the overall message of the book is. How does that sound? Who wants to kick off?
Shall I read it?
Oh, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Beeri, in the days of kings Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah of Judah, and in the days of King Jeroboam, son of Joash of Israel. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take for yourself a wife of whoredom, and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." So he went and took Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, "Name him Jezreel, for in a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Israel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. On that day I shall break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel." She conceived again and bore a daughter. Then the Lord said to him, Name her Lo-Ruhamah, for I will no longer have any pity on the house of Israel or forgive them. But I will have pity on the house of Judah, and I will save them by the Lord their God. I will not save them by bow, or by sword, or by war, or by horses, or by horsemen. When she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, she conceived and bore a son. Then the Lord said, Name him Lo-Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Yet the number of the people of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which can be neither measured nor numbered. And in the place where it was said to them, You are not my people, it shall be said to them, Children of the living God. The people of the Judah and the people of Israel shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head, and they shall take possession of the land. But great shall be the day of Jezreel. Say to your brother Ammi and your sister Ruhamah, Plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband, that she put away her whoring from her face, and her adultery from between her breasts, or I will strip her naked, and expose her as in the day she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and turn her into a parched land, and kill her with thirst. Upon her children I will also have no pity, because they are children of whoredom, for their mother has played the whore. She who conceived them has acted shamefully, for she said, I will go after my lovers. They will give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink. Therefore, I, that is, Yahweh, will hedge her way with thorns, and I will build a wall against her, so that she cannot find her paths. She shall pursue her lovers, but not overtake them, and she shall seek them, but shall not find them. Then she shall say, I will go and return to my first husband, for it was better with me then than now. She did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, and the oil, and who lavished upon her silver and gold that they used for Baal. Therefore,
Sorry.
I will take back my grain in its time, and my wine in its season, and I will take away my wool and my flax, which were to cover her nakedness. Now I will uncover her shame in the sight of her lovers, and no one shall rescue her out of my hand. I will put an end to all her mirth, her festivals, her new moons, her Sabbaths, and all her appointed festivals, and I will lay waste her vines and her fig trees, of which she said, These are my pay which my lovers have given me. I will make them a forest, and the wild animals shall devour them. I will punish her for the festival days of the Baals, when she offered incense to them, and decked herself with her ring and jewelry, and went after her lovers, and forget me, says the Lord. Therefore, I will now persuade her and bring her into the wilderness, and speak tenderly to her. From there I will give her her vineyards, and make the valley of Achor a door of hope. Then she shall respond, as in the days of her youth, at the time when she came out of the land of Egypt. On that day, says the Lord, you will call me my husband, and no longer will you call me my Baal, for I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, and they shall be mentioned by name no more. I will make for you a covenant on that day with the wild animals, the birds of the air, and the creeping things of the ground, and I will abolish the bow, the sword, and war from the land, and I will make you lie down in safety, and I will take you for my wife forever. I will take you for my wife in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love and in mercy. I will take you for my wife in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. On that day I will answer, says the Lord. I will answer the heavens, and they shall answer the earth. And the earth shall answer the grain, the wine, and the oil, and they shall answer Jezreel. And I will save him for myself in the land, and I will have pity on Lo Ruhamah, and I will say to Lo Ammi, you are my people, and he shall say, you are my God. The Lord said to me again, go, love a woman who has a lover and is an adulteress, just as the Lord loves the people of Israel. Though they turn to other gods and love raisin cakes, so I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and a homer of barley and a measure of wine. And I said to her, you must remain as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore. You shall not have intercourse with a man, nor I with you. Or the Israelites shall remain many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or pillar, without ephod or teraphim. Afterwards the Israelites shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They shall come in awe to the Lord and to his goodness in the latter days.
Well, 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 well.
Well done for the long reading.
Yes, thank you.
Very longest we've done, probably.
Well, it's 3 chapters. The last one's quite short, but it's the kind of the introduction to the book, and it's the one that kind of sets the. It's the kind of core metaphor of the book, and you can sort of try a little bit later on to kind of unpack how that metaphor might play out in the rest of the book. But first of all, let's just focus on this. I mean, what's your initial reaction to this rather strange bit of biblical writing?
Well, I would say a few things. Firstly, so some of the language is very off-putting, I think, for one. Very off-putting, especially in regards to this woman this imaginary woman who's been written about. And secondly, it's kind of like the basic point of this is a kind of, this is a kind of judgment against Israel that comes across, but then what's strange about it is the sort of way in which that's communicated, and that's probably what separates this book from those of many of the other prophets, I would say, is that it is probably what you said earlier, is that the gods that were being worshipped, it pertains to that kind of culture more, I guess. It's sort of referencing that time and place, perhaps.
I mean, the first question is he talking about an imaginary woman, or is he talking about his wife?
In which case, that's very sad and quite awful. And
the kind of traditional interpretation, I think, is that yes, it was his wife, and his wife was unfaithful, and what a good man he was, by taking her back. That's the kind of that's the nice Christian interpretation.
It's not very nice.
But you do kind of wonder. I think what Bible commentators seem to focus on that rather than what else it could possibly be.
Right.
And that's a core question. Is it allegorical or is it historic? Is he looking retrospectively back on his experience of a failed and difficult marriage? He's got 3 children, or is this a literary invention? And that even Hosea himself is part of that literary invention. And if so, what is the invention for, and why use such violent language?
Yeah.
I mean, I've sat in classes in the past where we've talked about this. I can't remember what we decided, but looking at it again, I'm inclined to think that it's definitely symbolic. Whether it's a symbolic action that he does for symbolic value rather than actually something he did and then made a message from afterwards, I think it's more likely to be a symbolic action. But I think it's definitely symbolic, I think. And I mean, it's not an unusual image. I mean, in the Hebrew Bible, there's quite a lot of references to whoring off after other gods. So it's a connection that is made not just in Hosea. It just comes to a climax in Hosea, as it were, with the image about the harlot. But I think, but in a sense, it's using imagery that would be known to the people. I would have thought that actually. That's a way of understanding you're going after other gods.
Well, that's interesting because I mean, this is a video I forgot when I was doing the introduction and my mind went blank. But it's in Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Is the image of the marriage of Israel, and the covenant is a marriage, which are later. So did Hosea in his writing, if he was did Hosea actually start that image off? And does that get taken up later by Jeremiah and Ezekiel? Or is Hosea a reading back over the history from a monarchical kind of era? That's the kind of question.
And because the pagan gods were all about fertility, that also lends itself to that sort of symbolism. I mean, interestingly, when you were slight aside, but when you were describing Hosea's context and the Baals and everything, it just made me think of the Wicker Man. That's essentially the world of the Wicker Man, really. So it's not so distant from us as we think, maybe. But because there's the sexual imagery in the Baals and in fertility, that lends itself to using imagery of as it does there, that gone after other lovers.
And in here, there's verse 11 here, I'll put an end to all her festivals, her new moons, her Sabbaths, and all her appointed festivals. So yes, it is talking about fertility, other cultic activity. But this little passage, you see, where from? This thing here in chapter 2 also has the sound of a divorce. Therefore, that accusation and this verse 3, I will strip her naked and expose her the day which she was born, which was seen as, you know, the punishment for adultery, and then therefore I will hedge her way with thorns, and I will build a wall against her, so she cannot kind of have this sort of mirrors kind of divorce pronunciations, you know, of the era.
But then I can imagine, excuse me, on one level, I can imagine a prophet saying all that stuff, and the men sitting around listening, saying, "Yeah, you do that," and then what they don't get is actually talking about them. It's not talking about a woman. It's actually talking about the nation. So that's actually quite powerful, really, because you're sort of using imagery and getting people to agree with you. Yes, in that sort of culture, that's probably what you would do, and actually talking about you.
Which is exactly the same technique that Amos used in the early chapters of Amos, when he does the critique of the different nations, and ends up with Judah and then Israel.
Yes, yeah.
I kind of get that.
It's like when what's his name says to David, "You are the man," describes that thing, and David says, "Oh yeah, that's really totally wrong what he's done." And they say, "That's talking about you, mate." It's actually that's good rhetoric, really.
Mm.
Getting people on your side and then turning it around and saying, actually, I'm talking about you.
Mm.
You've just condemned yourselves.
I mean, that's a fair point, and I get that. I was thinking about David in relation to this, and, you know, where does a man get blamed for adultery in the Bible? And David's the obvious example. But the uncomfortableness with this, which Harley was expressing earlier, is the violence of the language towards the woman.
Yes.
And this just
Yes.
continues to perpetuate the mythology around Eve. You know, it was
Yeah.
all Eve's fault. She took the apple.
Yes.
It wasn't me.
Yes.
And I think it's quite abhorrent. And the problem with what you've just described, Peter, which I don't disagree with, but the problem with it is that the men are given an excuse still to see women as the ones who are symbols of wrong.
Yes.
Yes. And men become, if they become wrong, become feminized.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yes.
Which is
Yes.
a really uncomfortable
Yes.
way to go. And I think, you know, where I've always felt uncomfortable about these comparisons with, you know, Hosea and this and the church and so on, and, you know, the church needs to come back to God, because no one ever addresses the fact that the church is always made female, but only to be wrong. There are times when she's described as a beautiful bride, but it's still, if I can put it this way, it's still male gaze.
Yes. Yeah.
It's there's nothing, there's no rights. I mean, how dare Hosea decide whether they can have intercourse anymore? What gives them the right for that? You know, that's the fulfillment of marriage. How dare he say that without any consideration or discussion of what's going on?
And
you
he
know,
buys her. He buys her.
I know. So she's a slave, in effect.
And
she has no rights.
She can't even eat raisin cakes anymore.
Well, there you go. That's Welsh cakes gone, isn't it? That's. I mean, I understand the culture of the time, and I fully accept what you're saying about, you know, that this would have been a way to get the men on side and to understand and so on. But the problem for us now is, what do we do with it now?
Yes,
because we can't do this. This is just so wrong.
Yes.
I mean, it comes as no surprise that a lot of the kind of reinterpretation of Hosea has come because of feminist readings of it. You know, I mean, that has completely changed the scholarship on the book.
And rightly so.
And rightly so. And it plays to I mean, it's pornographic.
Yes.
I mean, it is pornographic, and plays in the same way that, you know, pornography works. And it's abusive, etc., etc., etc. So where is the violence aimed at? You know, is it aimed at women, or is it aimed at something else? I mean, and I don't know. I don't think there is a way of getting out of how wrong this text is.
I think one, you know, extra thing to bear in mind is that, you know, there is this perpetual metaphor of sexual infidelity, but, you know, what he's you know, directing it against is actually the way that Israel was, you know, cuddling up to the Assyrians or whoever, you know, was doing, completely at the disposal of these superpowers. And you know, and I think it's and you know, probably at the time they're saying, you know, aren't we important now? Aren't, you know, these superpowers are actually you know, listening to what we're saying, but on the other, but really it was you know, they were in a really very poor situation.
Yeah.
Let me just share another slide, because yeah, that's a quote there. Hosea 1 to these gender, sexual and violent imagery seems to violate all feminist principles and to actualize. Can you see this?
No.
Can't say anything.
Oh, okay, I've done it wrong. I can't even find you now. Where are you? There you are. Share screen. This one, I think. Can you see it now? Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. This is a quote from a feminist theologian. Hosea 1 to gender, sexual and violent imagery seems to violate all feminist principles to actualize virtually every indictment against anthropocentric texts. Yeah, so and you do kind of worry about a lot of biblical scholars, you know, the way they've drooled over this passage. But yeah, just look at this. I mean, you know, there are other interpretations. You know, that the wife and the mother in chapter 2 is Samaria and its rulers. The lovers are the allies, and the political allies. The fornication is the political and commercial alliances. You know, there is a rather like the stuff in Revelation. You know, the whore of Babylon. You know, it's a way of very powerfully talking about trading relationships and so on. But here, I just put some core questions. What is the book about? You know, is it about God's relationship with Hosea? You know, this is God. You know, God asking Hosea to just the same way that Hosea would take his wife, God would treat Hosea and would take him back and so on. It's a very personal story, which I don't find terribly convincing, I have to say. I'll just read a little bit. Or is it about God's relationship with Israel? Is it the covenants? If you go, I'll just read these passages. Coming out of town, I think. But chapter 6, 4 to 10. What shall I do with you, O Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? Your love is like a morning cloud, like the dew that goes away early. Therefore I have hewn them by the prophets, I have killed them by the words of my mouth, and my judgment goes forth as the light. For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. But at Adam they transgressed the covenant. There they dealt faithlessly with me. Gilead is a city of evildoers, tracked with blood. As robbers lie in wait for someone, so the priests are banded together. They murder on the road to Shechem. They commit a monstrous crime. In the house of Israel I've seen a horrible thing. Ephraim's whoredom is there. Israel is defiled. And then the famous, really very well known passage from Hosea chapter 11, which is quoted of course, in the New Testament. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I have called my son. The more I called them, the more they went from me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with bands of love. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down to them and fed them. So it then becomes much more intimate, much more tender language, talking about, you know, God's covenant relationship. Or is it maybe all of these things, but is it a critique of rival gods? Chapter 4, verse 12. My people consult a piece of wood, and their divining rods give them oracles. For a spirit of whoredom has led them astray, and they have played the whore, forsaking their God. They sacrifice on the tops of the mountains and make offerings upon the hills, under oak, poplar, and terebinth, because their shade is good. Therefore your daughters pay the whore, and your daughter-in-laws commit adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they pay the whore, nor your daughters-in-law when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go aside with whores and sacrifice with temple prostitutes. Thus a people without understanding comes to ruin. So on. So is it about this critique of the fertility god and so on that's there? Or is it, you know, a critique of the language of the early chapters? It tends to lead us to the critique of the socioeconomic situation. So verse 6. But as for you, return to your God, hold fast to love and justice, and wait continually for your God, the trader in whose hands are pots balances. He loves to oppress. Ephraim has said, I am rich, I have gained wealth for myself. In all of my gain, no offense has been found in me that would be sin. And then lastly, is it a critique? And this is really a good thing. Is it a critique of the male leadership of Samaria? So, chapter 7, it's 1 to 7. When I would restore the fortunes of my people, when I would heal it, Israel. The corruption of Ephraim is revealed, and the wicked deeds of Samaria. For they deal falsely, the thief breaks in, and the bandits raid outside. But they do not consider that I remember all their wickedness. Now their deeds surround them. They are before my face. By their wickedness they make the king glad, and the officials by their treacheries. They are like adulterers. They are like a heated oven, whose baker does not need to stir the fire, from the kneading of the dough until it is leavened. In the day of our king, the officials became sick with the heat of wine, for he stretched out his hand with mockers. For they are kindled like an oven, their heart burns again them. All night their anger smoulders, in the morning it blazes like a flaming fire. All of them are as hot as an oven, and they devour their rulers. All their kings have fallen, none of them calls upon me. So, I mean, it's just, I just put those kind of things, and should we be reading, this is the question, should we be reading those first 3 chapters as a kind of prologue to these things that go later on? No excuse for the language of the first chapters, but you can see this sort of theme of corrupt behavior, and this pleading, this kind of the violence of the sexual language is the violent language critiquing what's going on in the society. The intimate language is the language which calls on the return to Yahweh. Does that make sense as a sort of analysis?
Yeah, I think that all makes sense. But I don't think it excuses the language at all.
No. I wasn't trying to do that. Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right, Vaughan. I don't think it's much about God's relationship with Hosea, but I think the rest of the points, it could be all 4 of those, and probably is. But the reality is the metaphorical way that a group of people describe themselves reveals everything about them. If we take an extreme, if you take Trump supporters, what's the language that they use to create a metaphor, a mythology of who they are? It's all about power and greatness and being better than everyone else. And the language is usually pretty violent too. And that, it doesn't really matter what they're talking about. What matters is how it's talked about, and that's where language is so powerful and so important. If you asked me to write a poem for a service and I came up with something like the beginning of Hosea, I don't think you'd be very happy.
No, we wouldn't. No.
It wouldn't be a metaphor I'd go anywhere near, because it doesn't describe the community that we're a part of. And that's for me. I accept all that you're saying about what it's describing, but what do we do with that? That was Israel then. What do we do now? What's our metaphor today to describe where we have gone wrong? And for me, I would use language around migrancy and homelessness, and use those as metaphors, because we've lost our home. We don't realize we have.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, I think you're right. And the really crucial question: what is the metaphor that you use? Because we're talking about violent situations. I mean, we talk about violent society. We're talking about, in Russia and Belarus and Ukraine, you've got warlords. I mean, trampling all over people in a horrific kind of way. You've got, and Peter was just talking about, you know, the worry list of Civicus about the UK and its the right to protest. You know, I mean,
Yes.
quite violent things. I mean, homelessness itself. I mean, these are very violent things that are happening to people.
Yes.
And sexual violence is happening to people.
Of course.
So you can't use that as a metaphor, because that's actually what you are. What you are trying to find a metaphor to oppose. You know.
Okay, that's a good point.
Would this be a response to it? That you know, you have these these chapters of Hosea. You have you know, the chapters where good things, well, you know, where supposedly good things are happening and supposedly bad things are happening. And what I think what both of these descriptions, where both of these descriptions go wrong, is that they have a really quite infantile relationship, or you know, view of, well, firstly of, you know, the way that people respond to, you know, respond to each other, and also the way that you know, you know, about the relationship between God and, you know, and if you make God simplistic and, you know, keep singing naive songs about God is on our side, then, you know, it will be probably parallel to the you know, the way we treat other people.
Yes.
That's nice. You know, and I think it's I mean, I don't know whether this is appropriate to bring it up, but the, you know, the sort of a lot of the critique of, you know, the American position in the Vietnam War was that you know, you know, you know, the Americans, I think quite rightly, thought that, you know, all was not well in Vietnam, but you know, they thought that all was not well in Vietnam because it had been led astray by this wicked communist, you know, movement, and that the way to you know, to respond to it was to do a lot of bombing. And you know, and I think in both of the, you know, it's the sort of way that you know, relationships with God and relationships with other people go bad or go well in parallel. And
Yes.
you know, and I think all, you know, thinking of the first, you know, few, you know, the first chapter or so of Hosea, well, it does seem very sort of idyllic, but it's also completely naive.
And I think interesting what you're saying about how some very simplistic kind of views, ways of expressing Christianity in a contemporary way, which is that, you know, about just an all-powerful God, you know, is also actually about reinforcing an image of violence and domination, which is actually a totally inappropriate metaphor for a circumstance and a situation where humanity has dominated creation and and violence dominates, you know, so many societies, that we then still talk about this all-powerful God, when actually the God we have is a God who lays power aside and finds an alternative, a different way of exercising power and understanding power.
I've always thought, sorry.
No, I was going to say there's a lot of power relationships in those early chapters.
Yes.
Hosea. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Well, that's the problem, isn't it? I don't know if this helps, but I've always thought a powerful metaphor is William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience. And I was thinking about that as Graham was talking about naivety. You know, the early poems are about a naive approach to life and to faith and to get all those things basically, and to love. And then he gets bitter and cynical, and those are the songs of experience. But where the new life comes and the new relationship comes is when the two are brought together, when what he has learnt is brought back to the childhood playfulness and delight. And it maybe that's where we're at. It's a bit simplistic, but maybe some of us grown out of that naivety and we've become cynical, and perhaps hard-edged, and we need to allow the playfulness to come back in alongside the knowledge that we have. There's not much joy in society, is there? And it's quite understandable why there isn't, but we need it as human beings. We don't live if we don't have joy, and I think that may be a way of approaching the metaphor. And if we don't have joy, we don't want God, because God's usually to blame for us not having joy in our rather cynical approach to life.
Well, there's anybody last thoughts on miserable Hosea?
It's been really interesting and helpful. I run the blog for the Bible and Violence Centre, the preaching blog, so it's inspired me to try and get somebody to write on Hosea. When and if that comes online, which will be next year probably, I'll let you all know. But
Right.
it's something I certainly feel I need to do more thinking about. And I think we all need to, because it was clearly a metaphor that was acceptable in its time, but it's not acceptable in our time. And in a sense, in our time, it causes more problems than it solves. So it's something we need to engage with, and it's been really helpful to have that in front of me, because the last time I looked at Hosea, I was sitting in a theological college classroom many years ago.
I'd slightly challenge what you said, Peter, because I think for some people it is acceptable in our time.
Well, I think you're right.
That's the problem.
Yes,
I think the prevailing view is, what a good guy Hosea was. I mean, he had this awful wife, and he was really, he brought her back, and it just showed that God, is willing to take anybody back, no matter who they are, and that's the kind of simple message. But it doesn't really wash with the text, I don't.
Maybe we should tell it the other way around with the.
Yeah.
See how that works.
No, that would be a great story to write. I might have a go at that.
Sure, I'd be interested to see it. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, but also in the chapter 1, God is actually God is a pimp. That's exactly what God does.
That's why Calvin was so upset by it all. I mean, he couldn't believe that God would do such a thing.
Brilliant, Graham.
Right. Well, there we go. With that thought, Graham.
Well, thank you, Graham.
Yes.
Yeah, that will resound for the rest of the week. God is a pimp. Yeah.
All right. See you all next time.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That was a strange one.